Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maite Green Mercado, Newark Campus Director of the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. And I'd like to welcome everyone who is online and here to our last event of the year at ISGRJ and the second conversation of the Race and Religion series. As you can see from today's talk and from the audience that is online, our aim at ISGRJ is to foster truly interdisciplinary conversations on race and racial justice. Our Race and Religion series examines the intersections of religion, migration, integration, and post-colonial societies with processes of racialization viewed from historical and current perspectives in the US and globally. During this inaugural year, we have focused on the racialization of Arabs and Muslims in the US, and today I am delighted to welcome Professor Sahar Aziz, who is Professor of Law, Chancellor's Social Justice Scholar, and Middle East and Legal Studies Scholar here at Rutgers Law School. Professor Aziz's scholarship adopts an interdisciplinary approach to examine intersections of national security, race, and civil rights, with a focus on the adverse impact of national security laws and policies on racial, ethnic, and religious minorities in the US. She is the founding director of the interdisciplinary Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and a faculty affiliate of the Africana Studies here at Rutgers University-Newark. Professor Aziz serves on the Rutgers-Newark Chancellor's Commission on Diversity and Transformation, as well as the editorial board of the Arab Law Quarterly and the International Journal of Middle East Studies. Professor Aziz teaches courses on national security, critical race theory, Islamophobia, evidence, torts, and Middle East law. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Soros Equality Fellowship in 2021, a New America Middle Eastern and North African American National Security and Foreign Policy Next Generation Leader Fellowship in 2020, Research Making an Impact Award by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding in 2017, Derek Bell Award from the National American Association of Law School Minority Section, and she is an emerging scholar of diverse issues in higher education. Today she will be discussing her book, Racial Muslims, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, which you can purchase here after this talk. And she has published numerous academic articles in the Harvard National Security Journal, Washington and Law Review, Nebraska Law Review, George Washington International Law Review, etc. And she has also written for the New York Times, CNN, Carnegie Endowment Sada Journal, Middle East Institute, The Guardian, among others. So we are very excited to have Professor Aziz here with us today. And it is also my pleasure to introduce Professor Deborah Amos, who will be joining Professor Aziz in conversation. Professor Amos is Ferris Professor of Journalism in Residence at Princeton University and an award-winning international correspondent for National Public Radio. Her reporting on the Middle East and refugees in the US is regularly featured on NPR's Morning Edition, Weekend Edition, and All Things Considered. She has recently covered the Syrian and Iraqi refugee crises, the economy in the Middle East, and the Arab youth surge. She has won numerous awards for her scholarship and reporting, and she was also part of a team of reporters who won a 2004 Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award for coverage in Iraq. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of 2 books, Eclipse of the Sunnis, Power, Exile, and Upheaval in the Middle East, which was published in 2010, and Lines in the Sand, Desert Storm and the Remaking of the Arab World. She has won several major journalism honors, including a Courage in Journalism Award from the International Women's Media Foundation, and a George Foster Peabody Award, and also an Emmy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sahar Aziz and Professor Deborah Amos in this conversation this afternoon.
So, two professors, how cool is that?
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you about
Indeed.
my labor of love.
So I read your labor of love, and I was very happy to do so. I learned a lot. It's not that I don't know about this. Of course I do. I cover the Middle East, and I cover refugees here, so I know. But you added so many facts to the bones of this story that in some ways I was like, oh my God, I didn't know about that. But you do. You are a target of some of this. And so I guess my first question is going to be, why did you write it? Glad you did, but why?
Well, this is an example of the personal being political and the political being personal. I was a first-year law student in my second week of law school when September 11th happened. I had entered law school with the objective, here's the irony, of going to work on civil rights, human rights, and democracy in the Middle East, specifically in Egypt, which is where I was born and where my parents immigrated from and left everything behind. And I was convinced that I wanted to be part of the reverse brain drain. And then 9/11 happened. And it was instantaneous. We went from being this either fully invisible or quasi-invisible or racially ambiguous group of people, depending on the context where in the country you were, urban, rural, north, south, east, but generally not really on the racial politics map of the United States, to being the most racialized, hyper-racialized group in the media. Everyone was deluged with media portrayals of Arab-looking men, Muslim-looking men, which was often converged or confused as terrorists, as threats to national security, as suspicious, as unwelcome. And it completely transformed my personal life. It transformed my community. I was raised in the Dallas Muslim community, which is a growing and thriving Muslim community, and also across the country. And another really important fact is that at that point in time, 2001, there were very few lawyers who were Muslim or Arab. The need for the community to have lawyers who understood the community, who had language ability, who could be trusted, was minuscule compared to, the need was very high, but the supply of lawyers was minuscule. So here I am, a 1L law student who doesn't know anything about the law, put out into the front lines, having to deal with all sorts of grievances of people being assaulted, being threatened, being harassed, bullied at school. And I found myself an intern at the ACLU of Texas working on a new project called Post 9/11 Discrimination. And it became a permanent project. And the ACLU continues, as well as other organizations, continue to focus on addressing discrimination against Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. So over the next 20 years, or I should say at least the next 15 years, which is about when I started working on the project in 2016, the book project, I was interning, I was litigating, I was engaging in pro bono policy advocacy, I worked for the government, and there was no shortage of work. And it's taken 20 years for us to finally, as a community, or communities, to have a critical mass of lawyers from the community who self-identify as Muslim or Arab and who want to do civil rights and social justice work, that it's, at least we have what I call a defense. And civil society, we have Muslim advocates, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, grew significantly. The Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, which pre-existed in 2001 but has expanded. The ACLU, there were many, the Center for Constitutional Rights, but in 2001, it was it was very hostile and very lonely. And those who dared to defend Muslim civil rights were called terrorist lawyers. Whether it was David Cole, who I'm indebted to because he was one of the first attorneys, whether it was various lawyers within the ACLU, and nobody wanted to touch us. We literally were radioactive. Just defending us was a basis for being charged with sympathizing with terrorism. And nobody knew that, nobody cared about the differences, right, between a Muslim who was a citizen, a non-citizen, who was from Pakistan, who was from Iran, who was from Egypt. We were all just bundled into one terrorist threat, and it affected every component of our life in a very adverse way.
You know, when I first saw the book, my brain played a trick on me. I read The Radical Muslim because you see it all the time. And it took me a while to go, oh, that's not what that is. This is something different. And I gave it a close read in the past week, and I started to think, I got immediately what you were talking about. But if you landed in the Middle East and you started talking to people in the Middle East about racial Muslims, would they know what you're talking about? Would you have to explain to them? And if you did, how would you explain it to them?
So race is a very American and Western construct that is intertwined intensely with the transatlantic slave trade, with European colonialism, with settler colonialism, especially in the United States. It's a social construct, and I am one of those infamous, notorious critical race theorists who teaches in law schools, not in K through 12 schools, which is where people are misdirecting their opposition to critical race theory.
I hope that you're defiantly going to Florida on occasion.
Yes, my defiance extends beyond that, but yes. So this social construct is very American focused and European focused, although I think in Europe it tends to articulate itself more along immigrant status, ethnicity, national origin, for various reasons. But this book is very much focused on the United States and very much focused on the experiences of Muslims who have immigrated or from Muslim majority countries, primarily the Middle East and North Africa, or were mistaken as such, their children and their grandchildren. So in the Middle East or in Muslim majority countries, they absolutely understand the concept, which is mainly couched in Orientalism and clash of civilizations narratives, because that's the paradigm under which they've suffered as formerly colonized countries. In other words, they understand that there is bias against Muslims, that there is hatred for Islam or suspicion of Islam or presumptions that Islam teaches violence, presumptions that Muslims support politically motivated violence as a matter of faith, which of course is false. They understand that the West and people who live in the West are frequently mistaking extreme fringe violent groups, who we can call terrorists, we can call militias, we can call insurgents. They're engaging in politically motivated violence for various purposes. And they do it under the guise of Islam. But if you ask most Muslims across the world, they'll tell you this is a very specific geopolitical conflict that tends to be often part of a civil war, part of a foreign occupation, or a response to political repression by their own government. They do not in any way think, oh yeah, they all represent us. Al-Qaeda represents us. Osama bin Laden represents us. Right? Hezbollah represents us. Hamas represents us. And I'm naming groups that the US has designated as terrorists. They couch it in the same context as the Ku Klux Klan in America, as the Proud Boys, as the Oath Keepers. Right? I mean, how laughable is it to go to other countries and say, yes, if you want to understand all white Americans, you should understand the Ku Klux Klan, because they all want to be in the Ku Klux Klan. They all sympathize with the Ku Klux Klan, and they either tell you truthfully, or they lie about it. That's outrageous and offensive. That doesn't mean the Ku Klux Klan doesn't exist, but we understand the context in which it exists. And so I think in the Middle East they're certainly sensitive to, and they're aware of it. Actually, another consequence of post 9/11 discrimination and bias was, especially in the first 10 years, it's abetted since then, is Arabs were not sending their children to the United States to study. You saw a decrease in the number of international students from the Persian Gulf and from other Muslim majority countries, from families who obviously could afford it. And they were sending them to London, or they were sending them to Germany, or they were sending them to maybe Turkey, because they were hearing about all of these stories of mosques getting vandalized, of women wearing hijab getting attacked in the street, of Sikhs who were mistaken for Muslim, who were being murdered in addition to being physically assaulted. And they were scared for their children. So we actually did see a decrease in international students, and that I think is and also anecdotally, when I would go back to visit, they would say, oh yeah, we're going to Europe, we're not going to America, for those who could afford to travel. The presumption was, we're going to go in America and they're going to attack us physically, which of course wasn't true in terms of as a general matter, but they understood that there was a deep resentment and hatred and suspicion of Islam and Muslims.
One of the things that was interesting to read, I mean, certainly I was a reporter after 9/11, and we felt exactly what you're talking about. You know, we actually got into some places where there was a Muslim in every jail cell because the roundup was so unbelievably intense. What surprised me is to see that police training still has elements of this Islamophobia, where you got to watch out for the religious ones. Those are the ones that will turn, and they are taught this, and so it perpetuates this notion that if you're religious, they're going to look at you a little closer than they would look at like somebody like you, who you've got no headscarf on. You probably wouldn't wear that in Egypt, would be my guess, on the streets. But here, this signifies that you are a secular Muslim. Right. And so could you talk a little bit about this notion that this training is still using these old definitions?
Yeah. So whenever you examine how racialization impacts what we call subordinated communities, as a term of art in critical race theory, it's not just it's the intergroup interaction, usually between the majority and minority, or the powerful and less powerful group, but it's also the intra-community responses that can be at a collective level or at an individual level. So how do people respond to oppression, discrimination, bias, hatred? And there's a wealth of social psychology literature that talk about these strategies. It tends to fall into what we call the identity performance literature. How do you perform your identity to avoid discrimination, right? And that can be from how you speak, to how you dress, to obviously how you behave, who you associate with, who you're willing to marry, who you're willing to befriend and seen in public with. And all of that is an attempt to, in part at least, avoid the adverse impact of being a subordinated group or associated with that. So when you think of kind of the most extreme example in African American communities in the past during Jim Crow, and is passing, right? Trying to pass as white, right? So that literature informs how I examine the responses of Muslims which is an extremely diverse community, extreme diverse population. So just a quick breakdown: 70% are immigrants or children of immigrants. You're talking about a population of approximately 4 to 7 million. It's hard to know exactly how many because
That's
of
not
the
a lot.
census. It's not a lot, although they got so much attention in the media. It was remarkable, as if it was, and there were even these anti-Sharia campaigns, these allegations that Muslims were going to invade and take over. 30% African American, right? And 30% Arab American or from Middle East, North Africa, 30% from South Asia, 5% Latino, which is the fastest growing number of converts, and another 5% that are multiracial or of European origin. And all of those, they were all being discriminated against in different ways, right? And depending on, the state doesn't have all the resources to go after everyone, even if it's only 1% to 2%. So they also have to be strategic in who they're going to target. So this is where I call, like, the racial Muslim is a topology. It's a hierarchy. You have the religious dissident Muslim, which is the most likely to be targeted by the state in terms of immigration enforcement and deportation, in terms of surveillance, counterterrorism prosecution, and so forth. That person is highly religious, and so they usually maybe wear a headscarf if they're a woman. They pray 5 times a day, meaning they ask for religious accommodation at work. They fast. It's easy to determine that this person is devout. And they're a dissident, which means they oppose the Iran war. They oppose the collective punishment of Muslims as a result of 9/11. Right? They oppose U.S. foreign policy in Israel, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia. They might not support the fact that we support dictators in the Middle East. They might not support the sanctions against Iran. They might find it to be completely counterproductive and punitive against innocent Iranian civilians, and so on and so forth. So it's dissent against foreign policy in Muslim-majority countries, because that then means you're not loyal, you're not patriotic. Because when you're a subordinated group, you don't have the fullest extent of your rights, right? So you may be able to dissent, and Deborah Amos is a thoughtful, critical thinker who is engaged politically and civically. We might not like her ideas, but it's a very American thing that she's doing, right? If Sahar Aziz does it, especially if Sahar Aziz is wearing a headscarf and devoutly practicing, suddenly, I don't deserve to be here. I need to go home. Go back to where you came from because you don't belong here. The second, so those are the most targeted. The second level is religious, but apolitical or mainstream political. And they're still suspicious because the fact that they're devout means we don't know if they're sympathizing with terrorists. We don't know if they'll be easily recruited by terrorists, because the link, the nexus of terrorism is their faith. That's the stereotype. The very fact that you're a devout and you believe in Islam means that you may be theologically committed to politically motivated violence against the United States. The third is the secular dissident. So someone who may be Muslim by name but doesn't really practice, doesn't have ties to the mosque or to practicing Muslims, by all, for practical purposes, fully, quote unquote, assimilated into white Protestant normativity, but is a political dissident on U.S. foreign policy. You tend to see they tend to often be those who are critical of U.S. foreign policy on Palestine. And they might be secular, they might even be Arab Christians, Palestinian Christians,
Sure.
because being Arab, you're presumed to be Muslim, which we know is false. It's a critical mass of Christian minorities and Jews who have lived there for centuries and never left, right, to go to Europe or other places. And then you have the ideal model Muslim, which is the secular Muslim. Apolitical, mainstream politics, fully secularized. You're the immigrant we want. And that doesn't apply just to Muslims. Right? We see this in various other immigrant communities. But that's the topology, and that's how you respond to people that say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. There is no Islamophobia. I haven't experienced it. So you have to ask some more questions about, well, what kind of lifestyle do you have? Who do you associate with? How religious are you? Do you express that religiosity? Do people know about it? Right? And so on and so forth. And so that helps to explain both the response of the communities and how the state targets the communities. And just as a fact, there were studies that were done right after 9/11 that showed that young Muslim women were taking off their headscarves. And that was to protect themselves, to the extent that their mothers were telling them that, their fathers were telling them that. And these were religious families who, as far as they were concerned, they believed it was mandatory. There's a big debate,
Yes.
as you know, among Muslims as to whether the headscarf is mandatory or encouraged. But that was the extent of their fear.
So right after 9/11, there were tons of reports. If you came through the airport and the people at the desk were able to question you, you didn't go up the line, it was them. The lowest common denominator in border security. And if you had alarms on your phone that went off 5 times a day, that you would get busted at the airport. Any sign of being a Muslim. And you write a lot about how this racializing of Muslims has actually denied Muslims the full benefits of freedom of religion in this country. And I wonder if you can talk about that, because some of it died down after 9/11, but clearly in your book, but not all, that it still happens.
Yeah. So there are different phases of post-9/11 discrimination, at least since over the last 20 years. The first phase was the severe backlash right after, for the first 2 or 3 years. And many of the Muslims responded with duck and hide. Be quiet, don't push back, this shall pass. A sense of extreme vulnerability. And that tended, and many of the Muslims who were in leadership positions were immigrants, as opposed to people born here or at least raised here, even if born abroad. And therefore, you don't have the same level of language conversancy, you don't have people in journalism, in politics, in law, because that type of collective human capital is essential for collective self-defense. Right? And so a lot of people don't realize, because 70% of the community is immigrant or non-immigrant, now we're talking about second-generation Americans, they all came after 1965, right? 1924 law, it sets very strict quotas on who can immigrate, and it was a explicitly anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic law intended to stop the millions of Italian Catholics and Irish Catholics and Eastern European Jews who had come for the last 40 years. Almost 40 million had immigrated. They were transforming the population in most of the major cities, and it was creating white nativist hysteria, white Protestant, Northwest European white Protestant hysteria. The Ku Klux Klan resurged, its membership exponentially increased, and it culminated in the 1924 national origin laws. And many people don't know that 1924 law is why the United States couldn't take Jewish immigrants and Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. And Congress refused to amend the law. Right? So it wasn't the Arabs and the Muslims who engaged in the Holocaust. It wasn't the Arabs and the Muslims who kept the Jews from immigrating here to the United States or seeking refuge. Right? This is a European problem. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because oftentimes Arabs and Muslims are presumptively anti-Semitic. They're presumed to hate Jews. And that's just absolutely false if you look at the history of the Middle East and you compare it to the history of Europe. So in 1965, so it takes 50 years of this whitening or Northwest Europeanizing, Protestantizing of the population. And then in 65, you get the removal of those national origin quotas. You also, a few years earlier, remove the Asian exclusion laws, which were intended to keep out the Chinese and the Japanese and people from Far East Asia. And that's when then people from the Middle East could actually immigrate in significant numbers. So I say that to say that immigrant Muslims and their children and grandchildren are very new to this country. Mm-hmm. And most of them came as doctors and as engineers and as business owners. They weren't lawyers, they weren't journalists, and they weren't politicians, right? So phase one was an extreme phase of vulnerability. Phase two was when my generation said, okay, we may not have a lot of experience, but we have to fight like hell because this is an existential crisis. Right? We are afraid of ending up in jail. I'll give you an anecdote, which I don't talk about, not an anecdote, a personal experience, which I don't talk about in the book, maybe in the next book. When I was a third-year law student, I hosted a conference called Islam and the Law, the Question of Sexism. The reason I hosted it is because I was sick and tired of hearing my professors at the University of Texas and their guests, who are other professors, engage in just unashamed Islamophobia. They were saying that the Arabs are irrational, that the Arabs just hate America, that Muslims hate America. Not everyone, but enough that it really affected me, and I decided I'm going to have my own conference. Because of course all the speakers at the conferences, none of them were from the Middle East, none of them had an expertise in the Middle East, none of them had language skills, none of them had actually gone and lived in Muslim majority countries. Yeah, they were talking to us as if we were these subjects, about us. And I invited all of these professors who were either of Middle East origin or experts, but people who really knew what they were talking about, and some of them had identities where they had been raised there. And as a result of that conference, the Army Intelligence in Fort Hood, Texas, opened an investigation.
Of you?
Of the conference. But I was the organizer. And they asked for the roster, and they asked for the videotape. Because somebody had made a complaint that there were suspicious Middle East characters. I was like, did you mean all Middle Easterners are suspicious? And the complainants were Army intelligence personnel that had been sent to the conference. That was the world we were living in 2003. That was my world. And this was a conference at a university. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a sit-in. It wasn't a boycott, God forbid. So that's when we realized that it's time to defend American democracy. This country, I don't need to go to Egypt. I don't need to go to the Middle East. This is happening right here in the United States. And if you weren't experiencing that, you wouldn't believe it. So for the next 10 years, we were fighting. And nobody believed us. They didn't think that the problem was that serious. There was all this, it's an anomaly, it's an exception. Oh, well, maybe you did something. Maybe you look the wrong way. Maybe it's a lot of victim blaming. Well, maybe there are terrorists in that mosque and it should be surveilled. Or the person who vandalized it, well, they're just crazy. And then the worst and best thing happened at the same time, and that was the election of Donald Trump.
That was the worst and the best?
Well, it was the worst thing for this country, if I may be partisan, for reasons that I think we all know, if you want to, at least for purposes of polarization and division and the rise of white supremacy and xenophobia and all sorts of bigotry. But it was the best thing that ever happened, unfortunately, for combating Islamophobia, because it laid it naked.
Yeah.
For finally, what we had been studying, what we had been trying to, the media didn't want to pick those stories up, right? We didn't have the platforms to educate and the public to say, there is a serious problem here. Religious freedom is under threat. Bigotry is becoming normalized and mainstreamed. Children are harmed. Women's rights are being compromised, because the only time Americans seem to care about women's rights is if the perpetrator is Arab or Muslim, but they don't care if it's an American that's not Arab or Muslim. Oh, that doesn't affect women's rights. So that's when you saw the airport protests, right, with the Muslim ban.
They were amazing.
That was the wake-up call. But Trump didn't just come out of nowhere. I mean, he was a culmination. He was just the mirror. He was the pinnacle of something that had been going on for years. And that was, I think, the point when more and more people who weren't necessarily personally affected by Islamophobia realized that the blatant, the entrenchment and the normalization of it was a threat to American values. I mean, it's not the only form of racism, it's not the only form of bias, and we know that Trump normalized and mainstreamed all forms of violence, of bias and some violence. But on that particular issue, it was very hard to get people to understand that it was systemic and that it was deeply entrenched. And so that, I think, helped to accelerate and embolden the young people too. So something else has happened in the last 5 years, where you have two things: the coming of age of now the second generation Americans whose parents were raised or born in this country. And they're going to school and they're being told in American schools that we believe in free speech, we believe in religious freedom, we believe in racial equality, we have the best constitution in the world, we have the best democracy in the world. We're so democratic that we go to the Middle East and try to teach them democracy. Except when the person who wins the fair and free election isn't who we want to win, and then suddenly we're not so committed to democracy outside the country. But the point is, that generation is saying, okay, so here's what I'm learning and here's what I'm living. And I'm seeing my mother, and I'm seeing my aunts, and I'm seeing my mosque, and I'm experiencing myself that the more people perceive me as religious and critical as a thinker, a critical thinker that doesn't just go along to get along, it doesn't try to assimilate blindly into the majority identity, which is absolutely informed for historical reasons by Northwest European cultural norms and Protestant identity and cultural norms. Well, now it's become more Judeo-Christian, it's expanded the national identity. The less friendly people are to me, the more hostile they become, the more I suddenly find myself not a member of the in-group, but a member of an out-group. And so they realized that we have a lot more in common with people of color who have historically been, and whose oppression has been documented much more than Muslim and Arab communities have. So this book is effectively one contribution among many to document that reality in hopes that it at least stops to a de minimis level and doesn't repeat itself.
That's a new word that I've learned from the Supreme Court.
De minimis.
Yeah. One of the things that you talk about, and it's a little shocking when you realize part of the reason that Muslims don't have full freedom of religion is because there are people, and some of them are in the judiciary, who say it's not a religion, that it's a political movement. And so you get rulings that are, of course, no one can say that officially, but they behave as if it is true. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that is possible in a country that prides itself on religious freedom, that can do this to one particular creed.
Yeah. So that goes to the fundamental research question that kind of animated my academic approach to the book, which is this paradox. How does a country that privileges religious freedom in its laws and in its norms engage in or produce such overt and mainstream discrimination, bias, bigotry against a religious minority, in this case Muslims? It's one thing to ask that question in France, which is a very different political, historical, legal backdrop, than to ask it in the United States. And I had really hoped I would find the book that would explain that, because it just kept going on in my mind, going, how is this happening? And then the fact that really kind of brought it home were these polls, well, facts, multiple polls that kept showing that the people who held the highest levels of anti-Muslim bias, when asked questions like, would you want a Muslim to be your neighbor? Would you want your child to marry a Muslim? Do you think a Muslim can be president? Do you think that Muslims can be elected? Can we trust them to serve in Congress? Right? Things of that nature, they would say no, 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 no. Right? Do you think that Islam teaches violence or supports violence? Yes. The individuals who were most likely to answer in ways that were Islamophobic were people who were Trump supporters and Christian evangelicals. Not all Christian evangelicals, but the numbers were significantly higher than if you compared them to Democratic voters or if you compared them to people who didn't self-identify as evangelical Christian. So that just brings the paradox, it just makes it even more glaring, because the evangelical Christian groups tend to also be the same groups who were alleging that their religious freedom rights are being violated when they have to bake a cake
For a gay person.
for a gay person, when they have to give a morning after pill, abortion, or contraception even, as a pharmacist to someone because they don't believe in that in their religion. And they tend to be, and it's pretty clear, they're proud of it, supporting the prohibition of abortion for everyone. Not all of Christian evangelical groups. But the point is, some of the most religious Christians who themselves declare or bemoan the infringement on their religious freedom rights support infringing the religious freedom rights, or at least support racist behavior against Muslims. And I kept saying, how do they reconcile that? Because either they're thinking, yeah, what we really mean is religious freedom for Christians. This is a Christian country, and if you're not Christian, or if you're not a religion that we've accepted, right? So if you think, some people would say we're Judeo-Christian, so we'll include Jews, but not Muslims, not Hindus, not Zoroastrians, not Buddhists. So either that, and they just don't think the First Amendment applies to everyone, or they've somehow convinced themselves of the fallacy that Islam isn't a religion. It's not legitimate. It doesn't count as a religion that's protected. And the reason is that it's a political ideology. It's a violent political ideology. So it's a fascinating kind of perverse twist on the argument that Al-Qaeda is a political organization. Hamas is a political organization. And that's true. They may use Islam as their legitimation ideology, which doesn't mean that all Muslims agree with them. But they're ultimately a product of geopolitical realities, right? So they've taken that, which is actually an anti-Islamophobia argument, to say don't stereotype all Muslims, and saying, yeah, all Muslims are Islam's a political ideology. And therefore, all these people, they're not really a religious group, and therefore, none of these laws and norms apply to them, and effectively, they're a race.
So, you ask Europeans deep down, and they will talk about the Gates of Vienna.
Yes.
That was a real fight.
Yes.
And okay, there's Islamophobia in Europe, but it's different. And I wondered if some of this, and that you have really sort of tapped into the bedrock of what it's about, the racial Muslim is about eugenics, because we didn't have anybody at the Gates of Vienna. We didn't. And that fight never happened in America. But yet, there is still, an uncomfortable fit. And I wondered if it gets caught up in how you got tagged at the turn of the last century in this insane 25 years. And it ends up being the undercurrent of the 24 laws. Because everybody's a eugenicist, including a president. Woodrow Wilson was a eugenicist. And I wondered if you thought that was a contributive, that's the American version of the Gates of Vienna.
Well, my kind of theoretical framework is that there are 4 factors that are producing the social construct of the racial Muslim, right? The racialization of Muslims. The first is white dominance or white supremacy, however you want to label it, but the dominance of particularly Northwest European, but I think it's expanded to European identity, xenophobia, which is another paradox of this country that wants immigrants, needs immigrants, and hates immigrants, and wants to deport immigrants at the same time. So xenophobia is a significant part of American society historically and contemporarily. It's just different groups get switched out. Orientalism, European Orientalism that was transported and transplanted to the United States. And then fourth, American empire building in Muslim-majority countries, which started in earnest after World War II. And I think those four factors kind of converge, and the interplay between them is what explains this racialization process, particularly post 9/11, although I talk about the pre-9/11 period leading up to it. And so this third factor, Orientalism, has, this country intellectually is a derivative of European society, particularly Northwest European society, whether you talk about philosophy, history, politics. You just need to go and see what students learn. They learn about Europe. And they spend years learning about Europe and maybe a little bit about Africa and a little bit about Asia and a little bit about the Middle East, and that's their world history, right? So we can't underestimate the influences of the Western experience historically. And although Americans are not, Orientalism isn't front and center, it's embedded and it's entrenched. And I think that's where you saw the rise of the clash of civilization within the public discourse starting in the 1990s, because once we lost the Soviet Union as our enemy, we needed another foreign enemy. We need another external enemy. And this is also part of America's history and a part of many other nations' history. It's a way to mobilize the population, to avoid internal fracturing, and so on. But there's been articles written about the Green Menace, that now it was Islam and not the Soviet Union, and 9/11 really kind of sealed that. But whether you're talking about Samuel Huntington, Bernard Lewis, who is European, it's not a surprise that the clash of civilizations was accepted so wholeheartedly by the intellectual elite. And I think that certainly stems from the relationship of Europe to the Middle East, which I think is actually a much more, it's much more connected to real political, geopolitical conflict. I mean, the Ottoman Empire was a serious political contender and competitor. And they did, in fact, occupy and conquer parts of Eastern Europe and Bosnia, Albania, Macedonia. I mean, there's a reason, that's why we have so many Muslims within that part of the world.
They just borrowed too much money.
Right, ultimately went bankrupt. So that at least is grounded in a real political dispute, whereas in the US, it's much more, it's manufactured in many ways. Because as you said, the Middle East, North Africa, Muslim majority countries have been threatened as nations, as governments, as people, have not posed any threat to the United States. And these political groups, if you really want to be skeptical and a critic, much of them, they have been bolstered, they have been strengthened by American foreign policy in those regions.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We all know where the Mujahideen originated from and where Osama bin Laden learned how to fight in Afghanistan. We also know that it was the United States that provided them the military and financial support and the political cover in the Cold War. And we can talk about Hamas, we can talk about Hezbollah, but you have to also talk about the situation of Palestine, of Gaza being an open-air prison. You have to talk about Lebanon and its relationship with Israel in the Civil War. These groups operate in a political environment, and what we lack, I think, in this country, because racism causes us to be intellectually lazy. Racism causes us not to learn and seek nuance because it allows us to just categorically dismiss people we disagree with or categorically dismiss their grievances and justify us occupying, right? As opposed to really thinking about things deeply and realizing that simply by removing Saddam Hussein, who was the most brutal dictator in the region, wasn't going to suddenly create this utopian state, but in fact led to the murder and deaths of millions of Iraqis, to the extent that some Iraqis have said, at least we had physical safety and security. Now, so the point is, it's, if you just say, well, they're all terrorists, he's an evil guy, let's just take him down, that's such a simplistic way of looking at it, and I think part of it is that we don't, when we stereotype, when we homogenize, when we engage in racist thinking, even in xenophobic thinking, even if we may not consciously do it, we actually hurt our foreign policy. We hurt our own interests, and we end up spending billions of dollars and causing the deaths of millions of civilians, including and also causing the death of our own service people in the military.
Correct. So this week was an interesting week. This week we had a green building for Eid in New York City. And I don't know if that's happened before. It probably has, and I just hadn't noticed it. But I did notice it this time. And there was an iftar at the White House. I don't think there was in the Trump years. I'd be surprised if there was. I don't think so. And
well, there are always some good secular Muslims that you can invite.
That you can invite. And so there's this concept that you talk about that I just really like. It's the racial bribe. And it's what other groups have done to become airfinger white. And, you know, Muslims have to decide if they want to do it. Muslims have to decide if they can do it, you know, because it has to do also with how you look. Can you pass? And so we're not there yet. You bring it up, you say it's what the others have done, and it kind of is the price that you pay. And I wondered if you thought that, A, Muslims will do it, if Muslims can do it, or there's another way as time goes on.
Muslims have, in significant numbers, started to attain that social capital, politically, economically, socially. So the Green Building may be a result of more Muslims voting. I mean, New York City also has a very large Muslim population.
That matters.
Now citizens.
Yeah, that matters.
Running for office, although those who run for office are often virulently attacked. That's my current research. And they are still not represented well in some spaces. And they're becoming lawyers and being able to defend themselves. But the question is it on condition that you act a certain way, dress a certain way, associate with certain people? That's not, I think, unique to Muslims. I think the question, the racial justice question, the social justice question is, how much do we allow members of subordinated communities the individual choice to be their authentic self as compared to members of the majority group, right? And I think that's really the true test of equality. So it may be that we don't let anybody be authentic, so at least we're equal opportunity cultural repressors and identity repressors. Or we could say, well, if you want to dress, there's a spectrum of how you can dress, of how you can act, of whom you can befriend, of what kind of ideas and critical thinking you can engage in. And that spectrum is wide if you belong to the majority group, but that spectrum is really narrow if you belong to the minority group, which means you're paying an extra tax, an extra burden. And to be fair, the racial bribe is actually, and I cited Gerald Torres and Lani Gunier, who wrote an excellent book, actually when I was in law school, it came out, called The Miner's Canary. And so this racial bribe, this racial tax, the disproportionate burden is in the literature, in the critical race literature. And it's just how much and what's the form of it. And so there have been Muslims, there's two strategies, and I talk about this in the last chapter, or two responses. And I think this is what the next generation of Muslims is going to have to really think deeply about. So when we got into the second phase post 9/11, which was around 2005-06, until maybe 2016 or 2015, the strategy of many Muslims that were immigrants and maybe had been raised part of their life here was, let's just expand the tent to include us. Let's try to change and expand the national identity from Judeo-Christian to Abrahamic. Because that was the very successful strategy of Jewish and Catholic leaders in the early 20th century. And unfortunately, it was the Holocaust and World War II that ultimately allowed that multi-decade project to succeed. And I say unfortunately because that's not how it should have happened. But anti-Catholic and anti-Catholic racism and anti-Semitism, again, had been going on for years. And there were leaders who were religious leaders, and I talk about this in depth in the book, who were going around the country trying to persuade policymakers, elected officials, other religious leaders, anyone that they could get a platform with to say, this is a Judeo-Christian nation. We are a Judeo-Christian nation. This is not a Protestant nation. And that was so that Catholics and Jews could be inside the tent. So one strategy has been, well, let's be Abrahamic. We're all people of the book, which is a term in Islam.
Sure.
We're all monotheists. We have the same prophets, just it's the same lineage. And we have so much more in common than we have apart. And this is all just a big misunderstanding, right? These terrorists are not, they don't represent us. And if you just knew more about our religion and you just did more interfaith work with us, you could understand that we're allies, we're natural allies. And in fact, religious Muslims and evangelical Christians have a lot in common when it comes to social policy. They share many of the socially conservative views on education policy, on all sorts of social issues. And of course, the downside to that is then where does that leave everyone else? Where does that leave Hindus? Where does that leave Buddhists? Where does that leave atheists? Where does that leave people who are not monotheistic in a country that is so diverse and will continue to become more and more diverse? And also, does that really address the fundamental problem, or is that simply addressing a symptom? And the fundamental problem is this superordination of certain groups and subordination of other groups. And so that's where this new generation, which are the people that are at Rutgers Newark, the college students here, we have 25% Muslim, Arab, South Asian, actually as high as 30%. It's one of the most diverse student bodies, and also a very large percentage at Rutgers Newark, who are saying, yeah, no, we don't want that, because where does that leave the secular Muslim? Where does that leave the secular dissident Muslim? Because you have to be religious to be in the group. It also, and we actually want to focus on systemic racism. We want to focus on systems that oppress, as opposed to focusing on keeping the system in place, but just trying to be the beneficiary of the system, trying to be on the winning side of the same system that has subordinated Native Americans, enslaved Africans, new immigrants, Chinese, Jews, Catholics. The system is staying the same. It's just new targets. And we want to change that system. We want to completely, upheaval it.
But hang on, hasn't every group done that? I mean, certainly, Jews have a huge stake in social justice and have been very, very clear about that. Catholics too. And the other question, and these are all issues about, are you talking about, urban versus rural? It's much harder to be a Muslim in a small town than it is to be in New York City, where it's quite normal. And it has been for years, and so it's not a simple picture what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's more of how, well, in the rural areas, it depends. So some Muslims in rural areas, because the community is small and they know each other, that they're able to leverage those personal relationships to at least exempt them from the bias. And you see this often, you know, there's studies on this where people will have anti-black views, even if it's at a subconscious level when you ask them questions.
But not my friend.
But not my friend, right?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting kind of irony that in the smaller communities, but your point is well taken. If they don't know them, and it's like big enough that they don't know them, you're right. There isn't a community that they can seek refuge to, and they're much more vulnerable. But I think the point is, how do you address Islamophobia? Do you address it by saying, we're good people and there's nothing wrong with the system and this is just one big misunderstanding? Or do you address it by saying Islamophobia existed and was able to thrive because of certain systems, and now let's examine what those systems are, because those same systems produce other forms of bias. And it's just more of an approach to that, to discrimination and to racism. And what we're finding is more and more young people are interested in that question, or those questions, than trying to prove that they belong, than trying to assimilate, and trying to perform their identities in a way that will satisfy those in power. Instead, they want to say, wait a minute, why is this the only right way to do this? Why can't you be comfortable around all types of Muslims, right? Why can't you be comfortable, and you can apply that to any group? And so it wouldn't make a difference whether I'm wearing the headscarf or not, whether I need accommodation for prayer or not, whether, in other words, treat me like an individual in this individualistic country. And that's another indicia of racism. Members of the majority are treated as individuals. Members of the minority are collectively punished by the bad acts of individuals, and they're judged as a group by certain individuals, or as a result of individuals. So if I find that this individual of a particular identity group behaved in a way that I find unsavory, I won't say, oh, well, this person did this and I'm not happy with that, or I disapprove of it. But it's more of, oh, it must be something about this person's religion. It must be something about this person's race. It must be something about this person's culture. And extend it then to that entire, rather than, well, let's find out about this person. What's going on with this individual? And we afford that privilege to members of the majority, which is why the government did not create a countering violent extremism program for white,
correct,
far right-wing political groups, and go into churches where you have a large number of people who sympathize, perhaps, with the Proud Boys or with Trump or with the former Tea Party, and say, well, do you know any terrorists? Do you know anyone who might support the January 6, 2021 insurgency? Do you know anybody who is trying to engage in a race riot or who subscribes to the Great Replacement theory? But that's exactly what they did to Muslims after 9/11.
So let me ask you about time. For Muslims, 9/11 was a setback. There's no doubt about that. And I mean, that's a huge tragedy. But I'm old enough to remember being a Catholic in the South, which wasn't great, and with a German grandmother in the North, which wasn't great either. Over time, those prejudices have subsided to a, you know, probably over the dinner table, people still say bad things about Catholics, but they don't do it in public anymore. And I wondered why Muslims would not actually, at some moment, benefit from the time issue. And do you think that what we need is a Sesame program to explain Islam? You could ask for one. And is there no amount of time that can go by that Muslims will not be seen as others in this society?
So that's a great question, and it's one that I certainly think about often. So the answer is complicated because Muslim communities are so diverse. There's a few things that are happening. at least let's say when we talk about Catholics and Jews, one of the ways in which Catholics and Jews became members of the in-group, there's multiple reasons. One was the transition from Protestant to Judeo-Christian identity. One was the second, third, fourth generation, just people having no other identity than being American, which makes them, for better or worse, less susceptible to being accused of having foreign loyalties, and also the socioeconomic mobility that then opens access to political power, economic power, right, social status, and the expansion of the social construction of whiteness. The social construction of whiteness in the early 20th century does not include Eastern European Jews. It does not include Italian Catholics. The phenotype, the physical features, and this is when you get into scientific eugenics, scientific racism of eugenics, was very much about England and certain Northwest European countries. And in fact, and I cite this literature in the book that was so fascinating. There was an immigration commission report in 1911 that was talking about, it was a commission report on race. And there were 46 different races, and 35 of them originated in Europe. The Iberians, the Hebrews, the Teutonics, there were, again, very novel to me. I learned a lot in that research. Yeah. But race was, whiteness has been collapsed for political reasons. So the question is, will your Muslim identity no longer mark you as permanently outside of whiteness?
But hang on 1 minute, though. Let me just interject this. You can be legally determined to be white, which happened to Syrians.
Yeah, and me, I'm legally white.
And it happened to Mexicans, legally white. But it doesn't matter sometimes.
Well, so that's the difference between the social construction of race and the legal status, right? And much of what I'm talking about in the book is about social, the social construction of race. But the other factor is going to be, so there will be, if a white presenting man named Muhammad can be considered white, then there will be Muslims that will effectively experience the entrance into whiteness and the privileges that come with that. That being named Muhammad will no longer preclude you, and it will relapse, or it will go to, what do you look like? Do you look European, or what we think of as European, which now includes people who look Italian and people who look Eastern European and people who look Greek, right? And people, which wasn't the case earlier. And that would then include Syrians, and that would include some Lebanese and Turks, right? Because all those can be white presenting. But if your name is Muhammad, or if you wear a headscarf, if that excludes you, then
we're not there yet.
Then we're not there yet. Now, there's another issue. What about those Muslims who cannot pass as white physically? And that's where you get Muslims kind of at the intersection of all these different types of racisms. And the answer to that is going to depend on whether we can eliminate racism against dark-skinned people and people who don't look European, right? Because then their physical features will racialize them, and even if their Muslim identity doesn't racialize them. So I hope that the book and the conversation motivates other scholars to write about this, and we certainly need more empirical research. And I hope that the racial Muslim will be, buried somewhere in some irrelevant bookshelf decades from now because it's no longer applicable. But unfortunately, I'm not that optimistic based on the history of racialization in the United States.
I would like to thank you very much. It's been just a joy to talk to you about this because I know it, but not like you know it, boy. You are down in the weeds, and those facts help you think about this issue. So I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It's an honor and a privilege to be in conversation with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation. There's a few questions in the audience, if you can take them.
Sure.
Delighted to take them.
Thank you both so much. I can't wait to read your book, Sahar.
Thank you.
So I actually was in Austin, Texas in 2001 working for the Austin American Statesman when September 11th happened.
We were in the same city.
We were, yeah. And then my career after that, really, I mean, I spent a lot of time writing about the profiling of immigrants from South Asia and the Middle East. And so many of those were actually stories of sort of mistaken identity, as you pointed out. The Sikhs, for instance, wearing turbans who were mistaken and attacked. And I guess my question is about solidarities, right? You mentioned the second generation and how they see this as a question of systemic racism, right? And they're thinking about what African Americans face as well as what Muslim Americans face, right? So I'm just curious, I mean, and that's very much, solidarity is very much part of the conversation that we're having now. I'm curious about solidarities that you may or may not have seen developing on the ground round about September 11th from African Americans or other South Asians, for instance, Hindus, Sikhs who were not Muslim. I'm just curious sort of what you observed in that moment 20 years ago.
Well, we live in a highly segregated society, which makes it very difficult to engage in solidarity in practice as opposed to in idea or in principle. Because living with each other, going to school with each other, socializing with each other, marrying each other, that facilitates that kind of solidarity that actually becomes very organic and natural, where you don't have to make as much of an effort because these are your neighbors, right? These are your friends. These are your family members. So, Muslims, like any other community that has a defined identity, absolutely are segregated in terms of socially. Now, part of it is also the immigrant experience, which tends to require creating an enclave to be safe. My parents who immigrated from Egypt, again, I was born in Cairo, but I came when I was very young. I remember telling them, why is everybody who visits us Egyptian? Where do you find these people? Because we lived in Dallas, it was a large metroplex, and I didn't really understand why. And I said, Mom, I thought you moved to America. Why don't we just move back to Egypt if all you want to do is be around Egyptians? It was only after I grew up that I understood that was their safe space. That was where they could speak their language without anybody mocking them. That was where they could tell jokes that people understood. That was where they could talk about all the different experiences they had through the same cultural lens and how that was their sustenance. And it's absolutely necessary, and I completely support it. Because it's so easy for people who are not in that situation to think, oh, why are you isolating yourself? Why are you segregating yourself? Well, socially, you need that. Now, am I doing that? No, I don't need to do that.
Although people still do.
I think that they do it when they are physically in spaces where there is absolutely no diversity whatsoever, in the schools, in the neighborhoods, right? And that, I think, is a different question. And I think that's more of a public policy issue of why don't we have more integration along identity. And oftentimes, the answer is in how wealth is distributed, in how income is distributed. In other words, why is it that some suburbs are primarily people of color in other suburbs, or inner city or suburbs, and why other suburbs are primarily white. And when they start to diversify racially or ethnically, it is often those who are of the same socioeconomic class of different identities who are moving into those neighborhoods, so especially as you get wealthier.
Yeah, but you know, the story of New York, and I mean, this is certainly the story of my family, that you grow up, for me it was a Dutch enclave in New Jersey, which became an Arab enclave. Because it has to do with who, you know, it's an economic question. So then all the Dutch people went someplace else, and they all went together. And then that became an Arab neighborhood because they were the next ones in and there were jobs. That's why the Dutch ones came. And so, you know, I've talked to demographers who work for the city who can show you, okay, this is where you start as a Jamaican, and then you move here when you become the middle class Jamaican, and then you move there when you're a rich Jamaican. And every community in New York is doing that.
And are they doing that the same, like all the Jamaicans are moving together as
Yes, they do. And I think New York, I don't think it's as pervasive as it was, but it's been the story of New York for a long, long time.
So the question though is, as somebody who was raised in, you know, middle America or Texas, is that New York is really unusual. And so how much
that may be true.
How much of that can we apply to the rest of, I mean, I think California and New York, you always have to.
And Chicago.
And Chicago.
I think this is big city behavior.
Right. So, but ultimately when you ask me about the solidarity, I think the question is, the harder it is to do it in your individual daily life, the more difficult it is to actually put it into practice. However, I think social media is changing that for the younger generation, right? I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, Trump, for one, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and arguably I think even the election of Obama, going as far back as that, has really politicized a new generation for various reasons. It's just that it's all virtual, which has its downsides. So I think in principle, and even just conceptually, it's people will call you out if you're only talking about discrimination against one community and not at least attempting to understand how systems of oppression work. And that is very different, I think, than before. And more, at least what I hear from my students, is there is more sympathy, more empathy, and more interest in understanding how mass incarceration of African American communities connects with Islamophobia, connects with anti-Semitism, which we've seen in a troubling, increase as a result of the rise of the far right, which that's pretty much what they've been doing for decades, or that's been their target among others. How immigration policy and how it's also very racist at this point, I think, largely against Central Americans, among other groups, but people from Central America are certainly being very directly impacted in harmful ways. Even the Cuban migration policy right now, there are all sorts of Cubans in immigration limbo because of the removal of the wet foot, dry foot policy and their inability to get adjustment of status under the Cuban Adjustment Act. I mean, the point is, I think this young generation is more interested in understanding all of these different social problems that are disproportionately impacting minorities of color as compared to earlier. And again, that's my impression based on working on the field. But there's a lot more work to do. But my assessment is when people are not engaging in these inter-community coalitions, I think one major factor is that they are not living with each other. They're not learning with each other. They're not working with each other. And so I would prefer to spend our time trying to address that fundamental problem, because I'm confident, maybe naive, that will help organically eliminate some of these identity-based divisions.
We have one last question, and I'm going to pass the mic here. Sorry.
Thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful conversation and wonderful book presentation. I mean, I'm so excited to teach your book and really have every single one of my students in my Sociology of Contemporary Islam class read it. I just wanted to also just give you an opportunity to maybe conclude and telling us a little bit beyond the book. What is your next project? What are you working on now? That's it.
Well, I have been concerned with the circumscribing of political expression and free speech of Muslim and Arab communities. So this book has focused a lot on religious freedom, or the way in which racialization has affected religious freedom. But another adverse impact, which I think has arguably gotten worse on particular types of speech or subjects, is the ability to engage in free expression and dissent. And we see that especially if people who are Muslim and Arab dare to criticize U.S. foreign policy on Palestine.
Correct.
The presumption that we hate Jews, which I find so offensive, right? The presumption that Muslims are just anti-Semitic, without any individualized evidence, without any factual basis. And when the evidence is brought forth, it's nothing more than political debate and discourse and criticizing a particular country for its human rights record and humanizing a particular population, Palestinians. And if we were to do that vis-a-vis Iran, if we were to do that vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, Egypt, nobody would ever accuse us of being anti-Muslim or anti-Iranian or anti-Arab. Right? They would say, well, that's really interesting analysis, and let me either agree with you or disagree with you on the merits, and let's talk about the facts, rather than engaging in these defamatory smear campaigns, right? And so I think that I'm interested in understanding, how being an Arab or being a Muslim subjects you to this stereotype, right? That ultimately then infringes and circumscribes your ability to engage in political life, right? Because it could be today Palestine and Israel. It could be something else tomorrow. And so the principle itself is unacceptable. Because again, the way one kind of simplistic, oversimplified test, but one to kind of start with when you're trying to understand, is there disparate treatment here? Is there discriminatory treatment here? At a group level, at least. Is ask yourself, if members of that group engage in behavior ABC, and another members of the other group engage in ABC, what is the response of society? What is the response of the government? What is the response of our elected officials, of our media? If you find that it is generally equivalent, then I think that that shows a sense of equality, right? Now, you may disagree with the responses, but now we're talking about the merits, and we're talking about something else. But when you see that, oh, well, they get a lot more leeway to do this, and they're given, they're presumptively to be they're presumed to be competent, they're presumed to be acting in good faith, they're presumed to be engaging in political debate, as opposed to presumed to be racist, presumed to be anti-Semitic, presumed to be disloyal or divisive, et cetera, then I think we need to ask ourselves why. And asking that question is really going to uncover many more myths about American exceptionalism.
Well, thank you both again for this wonderful conversation, and thank you for the questions, and for those of you who were watching online. And I hope to keep the conversations going.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Green.